On April 18th, 2014, two friends entered the massive labyrinth that is Jiudan Cave. On this dive, they plan to break their own personal depth records and reach a depth that is rarely ever made by cave divers. But unfortunately, during their dive, something went horrifyingly wrong. This is their story, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Today's video is sponsored by Babbel, one of the top language learning apps in the world. If you're a long-time subscriber, you probably know I'm Canadian. In case you didn't know, French is mandatory in schools here. Unfortunately, after being at a school for some time, I forgot so much of my once decent French vocabulary. This was honestly a bit of a bummer because of how much time and effort it took to learn French in the first place, and as you might imagine, not at all helpful in a country where a good chunk of the population is French-speaking. This is why I was super excited to work with Babbel when they first reached out. Babbel's lessons are all designed by real language teachers, so the lessons have you go through several different ways to learn the same concepts, like matching words with definitions, spelling words out, using the correct grammar, and even practicing your pronunciation, just like this.
La randonnée qu'on a faite était chouette.
La randonnée qu'on a faite était chouette. So not only does it accelerate your learning and enable you to have real-world conversations, but it's actually a fun way to learn, which obviously makes it that much easier to go through the lessons. And the best part about this is that when I'm away from my computer, I can do all of the lessons from the Babbel app on my phone. Babbel even has different subscription options, like a lifetime subscription. That's an insane value for what you get for it. So I'm curious to hear what languages all of you would want to learn, because right now, Babbel is offering 60% off a subscription for all scary interesting viewers. And this comes with a 20-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk in giving it a try with the link in the description below. Et maintenant, la vidéo d'aujourd'hui. That means, and now, today's video. On April 18th, 2014, best friends Wang Yuan and Wang Tao struggled to contain their excitement. The two highly experienced cave divers had explored caves in several different countries, but there was one cave system that they kept coming back to in their home country. China's Guangxi-Zhang region is home to Jiudan County, which is an area known for thousands of miles of underground and underwater cave systems. This area is also remote by Chinese standards, with fewer than 1 million people spread around the county. But despite this, adventurers from all over the world come to see what is essentially China's caving mecca. From the first time the friends entered a cave known as Jiudan Cave, they were hooked by all of the plants and rock formations inside and the massive expanse of tunnels. It's just an extremely beautiful place to dive, on top of how much there is to explore. There are also a couple of different entry points. There's a north entrance and a south entrance that each leads to different portions of the cave, and Yuan and Tao were well acquainted with both of them. In fact, by 2014, each of them had already performed 15 dives at the cave's north entry point. Because of this, the dive plan for that day was an aggressive one, even for divers with their advanced experience. Between them, Yuan was more experienced with more than 400 dives under his belt, but Tao still had an impressive 200 plus dives on his own. Even still, their plan for diving Jiudan Cave's north entrance that day called for both men to descend to the furthest depth they'd ever gone. Until that day, both of them had maxed out at 400 feet or 122 meters, which is already a depth that requires extreme caution. The guide rope that led from the entry of the north entrance extended to 525 feet or 160 meters, but Yuan and Tao planned to not only reach that point, but also extend that rope another 33 feet or 10 meters. So not only would it be the deepest either of them had been by 160 feet or 49 meters, but it would also require them to leave the main guide rope for a period of time. As you might imagine, portions of any cave can look similar, and it's very easy to get turned around while away from the guide rope, especially if visibility happens to be limited. This makes it extremely critical in cave diving and is essential to help divers maintain a sense of direction and space. To prepare for their record dive, the plan the two put together was meticulous and something they worked on for months. They did the math over and over again to ensure they'd have the right amount of breathing gas as well as the right mixtures. This is because diving as deep as they planned has to be planned out perfectly. Most of the air we breathe at sea level is made up of nitrogen and is safe to breathe underwater to a depth of about 100 feet. As you go deeper, the pressure causes nitrogen to enter the bloodstream faster than soft tissues can absorb it, and the excess gas creates a narcotic effect that's similar to being drunk. Obviously, that's not ideal in a dangerous environment, so to stem this impact, divers breathe gas mixtures that are made up of a smaller percentage of nitrogen. However, for any dive deeper than 217 feet or 66 meters, oxygen begins to become toxic as well. This is where divers will begin to add helium to the mixture instead of more oxygen. All of this is to say that for a dive as deep as the one the two planned, usually divers have to switch to tanks with different mixtures to avoid falling victim to these conditions as they get progressively deeper. Now, just 1 month before the dive at Jiudan North, the world-renowned French cave diver Pascal Bernabé was the one to extend the guide rope to the 525-foot mark. At the time of this dive, Pascal already claimed to have broken the record for the deepest dive using a self-contained breathing apparatus. His claimed mark of 1,080 feet or 330 meters was deeper than the previous record, but unfortunately wasn't officially recognized due to what record keepers believed was a lack of evidence. Either way though, even if he didn't hold the official record, Pascal was still clearly reaching depths that only a few divers have ever reached. So seeing this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to learn from one of the sport's best, Jiudan traveled to meet up with Pascal, who was more than happy to help figure out a decompression plan. As the two spoke, Pascal would end up telling Jiudan that not only would he have to factor gas mixtures to prevent nitrogen narcosis and oxygen toxicity, but he'd also have to plan for the threat of a condition called high-pressure nervous syndrome, or HPNS. This is a condition that generally occurs deeper than 500 feet, but these are relatively rare, so it's a condition that's rarely encountered. But essentially, HPNS is caused by the effects of breathing too much helium that deep. Complicating things further is that helium is used in progressively higher concentrations to prevent nitrogen narcosis and oxygen toxicity. This means that even the simplest math error can lead to tremors, involuntary shaking, drowsiness, and even changes in heart rate and rhythm, among others. After the two had planned everything out, and after being satisfied that he had the very best advice he could possibly receive, Jiudan planned a practice dive for himself and Tao in the Philippines that would take them close to 500 feet in open water. This would give them a chance to experience what things were like deeper than 400 feet and gain an understanding of the effect it might have on them. Unfortunately, as the date approached, because of Tao's work schedule, he couldn't go on the practice dive. So Jiudan then went alone and performed the dive just days before their planned date in Jiudan. This ended up going smoothly, so he hurried back to China to finalize the dive plan and make the last few preparations. On April 17th, so the day before their dive, Jiudan, Tao, and their support diver, Zhou Pei, arrived at the cave to stage more than 20 gas cylinders with various mixtures at appropriate depths. When that was complete, they all went over the dive plan for a final time. Their time from the surface to their target depth was estimated at 20 minutes. When they reached 557 feet or 170 meters, they'd only be able to stay for a few minutes before starting to make their ascent. This is because even a minute that deep can equate to hours of additional decompression on the return to the surface. In preparation for this, the estimate Jiudan and Pascal came up with was 3 hours and 50 minutes worth of decompression stops to perform a safe ascent. All of their gas volume was then calculated with this exact time in mind, so if they spent just a minute or two longer than that at their expected target depth, this could throw off their calculations entirely. In addition to finalizing the precise timing, as they staged the cylinders on April 17th, they noticed that visibility inside Jiudan North was greatly reduced by the continuous rain that had fallen the days before the dive. During the winter months, visibility can be upwards of 50 feet or 15 meters, but it seemed for their dive the next day they'd have just about 6.5 feet or 2 meters of sight ahead of them. However, the three divers assessed the situation and determined that it was still safe to perform the dive. After all, they were very familiar with the cave and the positions of the guide rope. Additionally, the passages of Jiudan North weren't particularly tight at any point, so none of them were overly concerned about the danger low visibility presented. Finally, the following day, everything was ready and the two friends stood at the edge of the entrance, ready to perform their record-breaking dive. Outside Jiudan North, Pei would remain ready near the surface in case Jiudan and Tao needed assistance during the dive. The two best friends then did one final equipment check before signaling to each other they were ready and slipping under the water. As they discussed beforehand, Jiudan would be responsible for keeping them on the guide rope, while Tao's duty was to fix arrows to the rope that would point them in the direction of the cave's entrance. Should they lose their sense of direction for any reason, the rope and the arrows would ensure they'd be headed towards safety. Several minutes later, at 393 feet, the pair were at about the deepest they'd ever been, and they took a moment to stop and check in with one another. Jiudan then gave Tao the OK signal with his hand, as if asking him if he was ready to descend further. Tao then gave the signal back, and the two continued on. Throughout the dive to that point, they'd each switched to the proper gas mixtures at the proper depths, but then when they reached 538 feet, Jiudan began to feel his consciousness starting to slip away. This didn't make any sense to him because he had been so careful with the gas mixtures, but it was clear that they needed to start their ascent to reverse the symptoms he was feeling. At this point, they were only about 13 feet past the guide rope, but they were in conditions that only allowed them to see about half that distance. Jiudan then led them back to where the existing guide rope should have been, using the extension of the rope he was hanging onto, when something completely knocked the wind out of him. The guide rope was gone. Even worse, still feeling the effects of depth, Jiudan looked at Tao and they instantly knew they were in trouble. They then continued on, feeling their way along the side of the cave and praying they'd come across the guide rope. And somehow, miraculously, they stumbled on the rope in the tunnel, and the relief they felt when they found it was indescribable. But by then, they had a new problem. Divers plan to the best of their ability for any potential emergencies, which is also factored into air volume. Following something known as the rule of thirds, divers plan to use a third of their gas on the way in a cave, a third on the way out, and another third in case of the unexpected. The only problem is that emergencies can cause a sharp increase in breathing rate, which means gas is used up more quickly. By the time they found the rope again, Jiudan's cylinder of his gas mix for that stage of decompression was nearly empty, so he had to switch back to his main gas tank. This was full of surface air. Initially this was fine, but very quickly by the 393-foot mark, he started to tremble involuntarily. At this point, they desperately needed to make it back to where they staged their next tanks, but those were still a good 150 feet up. Even still, Jiudan believed they could make it there before the rest of his air ran out, until he looked down and saw Tao was stuck under a rock. The low visibility had caused him to accidentally swim beneath a slight obstruction. Jiudan then rushed over to free him, but when he got there, Tao wasn't struggling to free himself. He was instead pointing his light at his neck, signaling that he was quickly running out of air too. Jiudan then immediately pulled his reserve respirator line from his tank and put it in Tao's mouth. After he had air, Jiudan managed to free him from the obstruction, and the two continued onto the surface, trying to contain their increasing panic. Prior to this though, Jiudan's tanks were already dangerously low, and now there were two divers with abnormally high breathing rates drawing from it. Doing a quick calculation in his head, he figured that they had just 3 or 4 minutes at most before the tank would be empty. This was then made worse by the fact that Tao was now extremely fatigued, and Jiudan needed to actually pull him with his right arm while keeping his left arm on the guide rope. By then, they were less than 300 feet from the surface, and Jiudan checked his gauge and found that they only had enough gas for one diver to make it another 130 feet. Luckily, by then, they had only another 50 feet to go to the next set of cylinders. But before they were able to continue, Tao just floated up right past Jiudan toward the surface and just disappeared into the low visibility water. Jiudan immediately knew that Tao was unconscious because of the way he didn't try to grab him as he floated by. He then quickly ascended the rope after him, but he couldn't see Tao anywhere. Worse yet, he didn't have nearly enough gas to leave the guide rope, locate Tao, and then get them both back to the rope. He desperately shined his light in every direction to try to locate his best friend, but as he did, his eyes also began to get heavy. He tried to shake it off, but he knew that his life depended on getting to the next tanks, which were at the 246-foot mark. Then, horrifyingly, after a few more breaths, he started to feel resistance from the tank on his inhales, indicating he was dangerously close to running out of air completely. So, with just enough to spare, he swam to the stage tanks and switched to his decompression mixture for that level. For a moment, he was able to breathe a sigh of relief and could turn his focus back to finding Tao, which immediately returned the pit in his stomach he was feeling moments before. He then descended along the guide rope in a section of the cave that was nearly vertical that he was also familiar with, yet at that moment it felt like he was there for the first time. His own condition was also deteriorating fast, and the tank he had switched to was one that he used on the way in, so it was hardly full. After searching for some more time, his pressure gauge indicated that he didn't have much air left, so Jiudan had to ascend to 187 feet to grab the next stage tank. This again wasn't safe because it was a mixture that was never intended to be used any deeper than that, but he just couldn't concern himself with that in the moment of desperation. He then descended once again, nearly reaching 300 feet, but there was still no sign of Tao. As the minutes went by, he knew more and more what this meant and began to feel like giving up, not just on the search, but on himself too. He found himself thinking about what a relief it might be to simply go unconscious like Tao had. And just then, Jiudan lost consciousness. This was brief and he woke up again a second later, but thankfully this time he managed to regain his wits and ascend to about 170 feet. By then, he knew all hope was lost. He then tried to abide by the necessary decompression stops on the way, but he was too panicked and the wait at each level was excruciating. In the end, he decided to rapidly ascend to where Pei was waiting in support. Just below the surface, Pei watched as a light suddenly appeared out of nowhere just a few feet from him. It was Jiudan, but there was no sign of Tao. Finally, after Jiudan switched to a new cylinder, he communicated that Tao was gone, which was met with complete disbelief and horror by Pei. Then, as if he forgot he was underwater, he screamed at Jiudan before rushing to descend along the rope to look for Tao. He quickly stopped a second later and rushed to Jiudan, realizing that he might still be in trouble, which is exactly what he was. Jiudan's frequent ascending and descending had his body teetering somewhere between narcosis and decompression sickness, and things were only getting worse for him. With Pei's help, Jiudan descended a bit in hopes of clearing up the awful dizziness and nausea that was beginning to overcome him, but it was no use. He suddenly removed his regulator from his mouth and began vomiting and twitching. Unfortunately, they had no choice but to abandon the search for Tao and get to the surface. What should have been nearly 4 hours of decompression stops for Jiudan was down to less than 3. When they were finally at the surface, Pei left Yuan to get help before returning to the water to guide him up the rest of the way. By the time he broke the surface, Yuan was in pure agony. His legs were in excruciating pain and his dizziness was debilitating. Thankfully, by the time he was out of the cave, emergency services had begun to arrive, so he was immediately carried out of the water and directly into an ambulance. Pei then assisted rescue divers, who were also showing up after the alarm had been raised, but because of the need to plan for gas and volume mixtures, the effort was delayed until the next day. There was now no doubt that Tao was dead. On the morning of April 19th, the first group of divers entered Jiudan North to search for Tao, locating his lifeless body at 167 feet, and an hour later he was back on land. Meanwhile, Yuan spent several days inside a decompression chamber and made a full recovery. His time in the chamber gave him a lot of time to think about the accident and what might have happened. Before he was done, Yuan had a full list of errors and oversights that contributed to the tragic loss of Tao. He concluded that all of these factors were a recipe for tragedy that was only clear in hindsight. It was true that they put significant effort and attention into making sure the dive would be successful, but the holes they failed to fill ultimately doomed the dive. In the end, he believed their greatest error was overconfidence, and everything trickled down from there. Before they even got to the day of the dive, the plan they had painstakingly come up with was flawed, and this all started with it targeting a depth that was significantly greater than anything they had done before. Beyond their previous max depth of 400 feet, every single foot matters and makes a difference in the dangers that must be avoided. And while they were breathing the correct mixture for various depths they encountered, pressure can affect everyone differently. And even beyond that, appropriate mixtures also don't eliminate the potential for the many conditions that can impair divers that far down. Divers can still be impacted by narcosis and oxygen toxicity, enough to cause issues, and there was no doubt that Yuan and Tao were having a hard time with extreme fatigue and clouded thinking. Had everything from there gone to plan, it's likely that this whole situation would have been just a close call, but the breaking of the permanent guide rope was the straw that broke the camel's back. According to Yuan, both divers were fear-stricken when they discovered that the rope was gone, but they didn't panic or become frantic. This likely spared Yuan's life, but even still, both divers experienced a sharp increase in respiration from both the alarm of losing the guide rope and the effort required to relocate it. And while that major issue was demanding all of their attention, there was another oversight on Tao's part that directly led to the horrible outcome that day. An examination of his equipment after his body was recovered revealed that his cause of death was likely hypercapnia or carbon dioxide poisoning. When a diver begins to run out of air, carbon dioxide can quickly build up in the body. And by the time Tao signaled to Yuan that his gas supply was running short, Yuan's tanks were also nearly empty, so drawing from them didn't help Tao much. However, tragically, it turned out that Tao wasn't out of gas. The second tank on his back still had enough mixture in it to sustain him to the next stage tanks. But due to their diminished physical and mental abilities and the confusion caused by the loss of the guide rope, Tao simply forgot to switch to that tank. In the aftermath of the incident, Yuan came to realize that Tao likely saved his life. When he indicated to Yuan that he was running out of air and started breathing from his second respirator, he did so calmly. There's little doubt in Yuan's mind that if Tao had panicked, neither of them would have ever made it out of the cave. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. I want to thank you all for your great story suggestions. Since I first mentioned it was getting harder to come by cave stories, I've received several excellent suggestions. However, it seems that there are still plenty more obscure cases that aren't easily searchable from countries around the world. So if you happen to not be from North America and you know of any local stories from your home country, I'd be happy to hear them. I've actually received several recently that don't even show up in search results because all of the sources are in different languages. Anyway, thanks again. And once again, a huge thank you to Babbel for sponsoring this video. Make sure to check them out using the link in the description for 60% off a subscription. And hopefully, I will see you in the next one.